Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. I've always really enjoyed these events. So while I'm obviously no longer in the games industry, I was intrigued coming back and thought it'd be useful to talk about what I've learned since leaving the games industry, and maybe a bit of a kind of compare and contrast of what the similarities and differences are. And so that's what I want to run through today. Cool. So a bit of context. I did actually come from the food industry, grocery delivery with Ocado before King, so it's a little bit of a loop back, which is kind of interesting. But I spent 5 years at King doing all sorts of good stuff to do with data and analytics, and had a real blast with that. So 3 courses for today, given I work for food business, it's all about courses. So to start, just some sort of basic similarities. There's obviously huge overlap between doing good analytics at a company like Deliveroo and at a company like King. So a huge range of similarities. So I'll gloss over those really, really fast, and then dive into what I see as some of the important differences. And then I'll dive in, hopefully I'll try and move fast in terms of keeping on our strict time schedule to dive into sort of some of the interesting complex experiment designs that we have to do. I suppose I want to try and approach this from the point of view of trying to explain a bit about why some of those differences are there, because I think it's probably, I think that's probably the most helpful thing for everyone here, is to think about that sort of why. And there may well be situations and circumstances in particular kinds of games where some of those whys are actually equally important, and that can maybe trigger some thought for yourselves and hopefully be useful. So let's start off. Basic similarities. So there's a huge host of those, particularly just around what does doing good analytics look like. And you've got to have the right data, you've got to really understand your metrics, and avoid focusing too much on averages, and understand those distributions. You've got to be able to do great experimentation, deeply understand your customer. One thing that I've found a tremendous value in over the years is doing high impact experimentation, being very hypothesis driven, as opposed to kind of feature driven or kind of bundling everything together driven, really trying to understand the reasons behind things and learning through that. Impact driven culture and the right people who kind of embody all of this sort of stuff. So at least that's in a nutshell what I've seen worked extremely well at King and extremely well at Deliveroo. Very much the same, just great people doing great work along all of those sorts of dimensions. There are some interesting similarities that, between new game development that I observed at King and some of the new opportunity, new business line development at Deliveroo. They're definitely not the same, but there's some interesting similarities. I don't want to dive into that today because I think that would be a bit of a kind of side avenue that would sort of occupy us a bit long. So that's my whistle-stop tour of the basic similarities. I want now to spend most of the time talking about the important differences. So I put together really 5 headline areas, and I'll run through these in turn. Obviously there's a big difference between virtual worlds and the real world, and there's some particular reasons how I've noticed that that's important. There aren't that many reasons, actually, I should say, but there are some very particular ones, how that's important to the kinds of analytics that we do. There's a variety of ways in which there's in many ways a more complex analytical world at Deliveroo, and I'll try and talk through some of that. The next one's an interesting one. I feel there's sort of greater scope for getting real sort of value and benefits out of machine learning at Deliveroo than I saw at King. That's not to say there was no scope at King, there definitely was some, but there seems to be more opportunity for that, and I'll talk through that. And then the fourth one's an interesting one about sort of making things slightly easier to actually structure data science and the role of a data scientist or an analytics person for success, and having real impact that I've observed, which was always a little bit of a sort of tension point, or not always, but was often a bit of a tension point at King, about how to make that role something that was really easily successful. And then I'll talk about experiment designs. So first topic then, really. So I guess let me give a couple of examples of this and then try and explain a bit about the sort of why. Actually, the easiest ones to start with are maybe the sort of search and SEO side of things. So it turns out that people are very interested in food and dishes and restaurants and all those sorts of things. So there's lots of activity on the internet around that. People search for those sorts of things. Therefore, having a good SEO approach to getting people's search results to, getting your pages to feature very high in search rankings so people come to them organically without having to be paid, but equally on the paid search side, you're willing to pay quite a lot through search. So there's sort of, the real world involves people going through all those sorts of activities, and therefore you want to harness that if you're in the food industry. For customer acquisition purposes, retention, engagement, all of those sorts of things, and that's a complete contrast to my experience in the games industry, where at King we spent extremely little money on paid search advertising. It all went on other kinds of advertising because it just wasn't the real world experience wasn't that people were searching for a specific game at all. So that's sort of one example of how I've sort of understood you really need to understand what is it in the habits and sort of behaviours and actions of people that you are trying to either sort of capture or exploit or nudge in a particular way, and so a very different set of things there. Another one, just as a sort of nuance here, email marketing, CRM, all that sort of stuff. We certainly made pretty good use of it, King, but it was never sort of a major impactful thing. Our games players didn't really, we didn't have an email relationship with them. Most of them weren't interested in that at all, and so that channel, did have a quantifiable, measurable, useful impact, but it was small. Whereas at Deliveroo, it's not quite as important as some of these things, but we do have a transactional email relationship with people based around their ordering habits and so on. And so there's a natural avenue to kind of make use of that. And so that channel is actually a surprisingly large one for us, and really generates a huge amount of incremental value to the business. It took quite a long time to get there, I should say. About a year and a half ago, it was adding zero value to the business, and it's now a good percentage in terms of driving incremental growth. And then the last one I've got up there is around churn. So, and this is again sort of about people's habits and behaviours, and what. So I guess my experience from games is that there's a more clear-cut definition of churn that made sense in terms of people's behaviour. So the behaviour of an engaged player is a fairly frequent, it could be every single day, multiple times a day in extreme cases, but it's a high frequency thing measured at the very least in the notion of multiple times per week. And so if you haven't seen someone play a game for, let's say, a month, that's basically a pretty good definition that they are gone, and the likelihood of them coming back is low. Some of them, of course, will, but the likelihood is extremely low. And if you ask them, they probably will tell you, yeah, I've kind of lost interest in that game, not really playing it anymore. So they would self-identify as a churned player. At Deliveroo, we see a much fuzzier distinction there. There are plenty of people who order from us like once every 2 months, once every 3 months, and that's just their frequency of ordering food. And if you talk to them, we use as an informal definition, we use if we haven't seen you for 60 days, you're churned. But it's not a really great definition, because you talk to those people and they're like, no, you just haven't ordered recently. I'm still a customer. I love Deliveroo. It's great, but their frequency is just much lower. And so there's no kind of natural cutoff point that we can use there, and that means trying to work out what you're supposed to do to kind of reactivate people who are churned is really hard, because you're not even sure who you're trying to target there in the first place, and naive things that you end up doing just end up handing free money to people who are actually going to order anyway because they're not even churned. So that's sort of understanding these kind of real-world dynamics of how people behave, I've found to be really, really valuable there. And that's equally valuable across both, and these are just some examples of some of the weirdest ways in which the real world kind of intrudes in Deliveroo in particular ways. So that's my first one. Second one, around the sort of more complex analytical world. So there's all sorts of stuff here that's super interesting. So one whole angle is, as a business that doesn't deal purely with virtual goods that have no costs attached to them, we have variable revenues and variable costs. So people can order varying amounts of food, and there's from just a few pounds for something up to endless amounts really. But the costs attached to that are also variable. The delivery costs attached, the relationship with the restaurant also dictates a certain amount of variable costs there. Time of day is an issue there, and the kind of rider who will deliver that food. I'm kind of assuming here actually everyone knows what Deliveroo is. Might have been an error. So Deliveroo allows customers to order from restaurants and arranges for a rider to deliver the food to your door, and typically does so in less than 30 minutes. That's the basic model. So maybe you should have got that down first. So the fact that both of these are sort of variables, first of all, the fact that there are two of these and not just one, and the fact that both of them are variables makes for all sorts of quite interesting dynamics. In that you can certainly have unprofitable transactions. If your variable costs are quite high and the size of the order the customer places is quite low, that's say a negative transaction. That might be, you might conclude from that as a transaction you don't want. It might be that you need to look a bit more broadly and look at the particular customer and their sort of history, and if they normally order larger amounts and this just happens to be a smaller one, then on aggregate you've got a good customer with positive lifetime value. But anyway, it's a sort of complicated world there, and the sort of dynamics and understanding of these things is super important. The second one here is sort of network effects, scarce resources. There's sort of two angles to this. One is, let's maybe touch on the scarce resources bit first, that it's not the case that more is better at Deliveroo, whereas at King, I think I would say that without fail, it was always that more was better. More players, more gameplay, more hours, more whatever. That's always better. At Deliveroo, we need to balance things out. Restaurants need to have the capability to, the capacity in the kitchen to cook the food, the number of riders we've got, and the number and the orders that are coming in all need to balance. If we have insufficient riders, then more customers isn't helpful. We're going to let them down, and then service times are going to get horrible. Food will arrive cold. Customers will be complaining a lot. We'll have to give out loads of refunds. So horrible situation. But equally, if we've got way too many riders and not enough orders, then those riders are really unhappy. They won't get enough orders per hour to make a decent wage. All of those sorts of things. So more. And so this dynamic operates on lots and lots of time scales. It operates on a kind of minute by minute, hour by hour scale that we need to balance all these sorts of things. And so we've got all sorts of controls to do that. But equally it operates on a kind of week by week, month by month, quarter by quarter basis. The number of riders who we need to try to assign onto our system and sort of acquire into our system, we need to plan that out in advance, so that we have approximately the right number available. And it's a massive seasonal business, so summer everyone goes away, it's nice and sunny, everyone likes to eat out, and then when it comes to September, October, suddenly it starts raining a lot and it gets dark and everyone wants to eat at home and get tons of deliveries. So we have to try and balance all that out in this strange world where three different things need to match up. So that makes things really interesting from a analytics point of view. And then there's a really, I touched on it maybe slightly, very interesting network effects going on in the delivery network itself. So I mean, I can probably speak for about an hour purely on this one topic, but it's the interactions between how much we push to get really fast delivery to customers versus getting efficient delivery and then getting riders just how to maximize their number of orders per hour that they can deliver so that they can earn a good wage. Those things have really strange network effects where actually the optimization functions and the criteria, the optimization function that we use to control that optimization algorithm actually need to be different for when we are on a sort of peak heavy load time versus a quieter load. So I'm not sure if that was comprehensible or not, because it's just a very complex topic, but there's really interesting things there. The sort of hyper-local nature means that even more so than at King, I would say, looking at averages is just really unhelpful. You can be doing wonderfully in Deliveroo as a business over here and really poorly there. And those two areas, if they are more than about 6 miles apart, are basically independent businesses, really. So looking at any kind of city type, we obviously do look at city averages, so you can't scrutinize every number, but you really do need to get down to the level of small geographical regions, and each of those needs to look great. And that's really interesting, particularly when you combine it with the fact that with this three-sided marketplace, so in that area, the restaurants, the riders, the customers, everything needs to line up well. So that makes some really intricate things. And I suppose, altogether, all of this means there's a sort of a larger diversity of metrics that we worry about all the time and try to optimize and improve. And that maybe has implications more for how we structure ourselves. So we have teams. Teams are mostly focused on metrics as opposed to other things. So a team will have one or two quite narrow metrics that they focus their lives on improving. And that's how we deal with the fact that there's just this huge range of things there. So third area I wanted to go to was sort of greater scope for large real value from machine learning. And the most obvious result of that was different at King was, we largely at Deliveroo have two distinct data science roles. We have a product analytics role, which was, so all of these people are called data scientists, but there's some who live and breathe what we call product analytics, which was by and large what almost all of the data scientists at King did. And there's loads of experimentation, analysis, and all sorts of great stuff in there. And then there's another set of people who spend all their lives working on algorithms of sort of optimization algorithms and machine learning algorithms. I suppose the question is sort of why are those things important to us? There are some obvious ways in which we've got some really sort of real-time problems that need optimizing, and I'll explain one of those later, so I won't touch upon it now. But when I think of some of, say, the recommendation systems and things like that, at King, I would say, recommender systems and things like that were sort of a nice to have. They, made certain things a little bit nicer for the players, whereas at Deliveroo, difference between having a good recommender system and a bad one can mean the difference between an order being placed at all or not, or the difference between that order being profitable because you've recommended some wonderful things for the customer to add to that order versus that order being an unprofitable one. So in that sense, recommender systems and optimization algorithms are not sort of nice to haves that kind of add a little bit on top. They're actually sort of fundamental, critical things to the to the viability of the business. And in our sort of dispatch algorithms that control our network and assign riders to restaurants and customers to fulfill that delivery, in those things, every if we can make an improvement of 10 seconds on average, that's a huge, genuinely important difference. And we've run successive, experiments improving those algorithms over the last couple of years, where we have achieved, 10 seconds here, 15 seconds there, and those things, the amount of real money that those lead to is huge. And on top of that, that's also huge for improving the rider proposition, because every time that you shave off some seconds there, that means the riders who are basically paid by the drop with a variable fee attached to distance, that means they have more time available to do more orders. So what we call the throughput, which is basically the orders per hour, actually increases there. So those sorts of things are kind of win-win-win. And so that means we've built all sorts of algorithms to try to, not just to do that optimization, but also to predict everything that's going on there. So we need to predict how long it's going to take for this restaurant at this time of day to prepare this particular dish. We need to predict how long it's going to take a whole set of different riders how long it's going to be until they're free from the previous bit of work that they're doing, and then from that, how long it would take them to ride to that particular restaurant, and any improvements in accuracy of those different predictive algorithms, even at the level of kind of 10 seconds improvement, generally speaking, lead to big improvements to the overall network. There are a few weird cases we've encountered over time where, due to some of these strange sort of feedback effects that take place, sometimes things don't turn out quite as expected, and that's obviously why you need to run nice controlled experiments. And I'll come to one example of that later. So, I don't know, this whole thing, there's a lot more there that was sort of fundamentally critical to the business than I ever saw at King. This one's a sort of interesting one. Maybe a sort of quick show of hands, please. Who here, from an analytics and data science point of view, feels that they spend a lot of their role giving recommendations to others to change things, implement things, whatever? So it's about a quarter, a third. Certainly I found at King that was a large part of the data science role, was giving those sort of recommendations, and then a large part of the frustration of the data science role was that those recommendations usually needed to be accompanied by a large sales effort, and then were often not successful in actually leading to the decision that you wanted. The recommendation you made was not always adopted. So let me come to the slightly easier bit. It's easier for us at Deliveroo to avoid that problem because we are able to structure our teams really fully around sort of a narrow set of goals or metrics, where the data scientists, the product analytics folk, etc., they are just part of that team. All of that team has exactly the same goals. And so when that group of people decide that a piece of analysis should be done to reach some sort of it's not even the language that is used is not even about recommendations. It's like let's do this analysis so we can decide what to do here. And okay, data scientist comes back a day, a week, whatever later with their analysis. Everyone debates it, scrutinizes it, and it's like, okay, we've made the decision. Let's do it. So that works really, really nicely from a data science point of view. So why is it that we could do that, but at King we were unable to do that, or largely unable to do that? And the main distinction there, I think, was that a large portion of our game teams at King were focused on taking that game forwards. Developing the new features, new levels, new capabilities, which were not things that the data scientist was involved with. The data scientist was involved with, hey, I'm trying to optimize this game, make it better, trying to improve monetization, retention, whatever. And so there was this sort of, and the game team in most cases wasn't large enough to be split into okay, here's a group of people driving forwards for the future, and here's a group of people optimizing and tuning. That was something we were able to do in Candy Crush pretty effectively, and there this sort of problem didn't occur. But in many of the game teams there was this constant kind of tension there between this sort of this recommendation and this group of people who are much more excited about just building new stuff into the future of the game. And so that's a sort of very interesting difference I observed, which is quite pleasant for the data scientists involved, I have to say. So the last one I want wanted to cover on was some more complex experiment design. So let me run through this really quickly. So it's a quick view of our dispatch algorithm. So there's a bunch of customers in their homes. There's a bunch of riders who are heading about doing various deliveries underway. Some may be idle at any particular moment in time. There's a bunch of restaurants, and we need to constantly model and predict, as I mentioned, how long it's going to be before various people are going to be free. When a customer places an order, how long it's going to take for that food to be prepared. And there's huge variability in all of those things. None of them we can predict, stunningly well, or at least very few of them we can predict stunningly well. But that's sort of the data, the sort of our model of the world that we're dealing with. And then, how can we run experiments on the dispatch algorithms? The dispatch algorithm is the algorithm that needs to decide when this customer places an order for Wagamama, which rider am I going to send to that order, and what time can I then update the customer that they should expect that order to arrive? And the dispatch algorithm needs to be doing that continuously for everything in this area. So it's a very high speed, dynamically changing optimization problem where you need to be really careful not to over optimize for the present, and by doing so you can screw the future. So you need to sort of understand that there's a perpetually, the time horizon of the future is constantly moving back, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's the dispatch algorithm. We want to run experiments on this to say, is dispatch algorithm A better than dispatch algorithm B? And we've got huge value out of that, but it's really hard to do well. So we can't run an A/B test on orders because the dispatch algorithm is managing all of this setup, and we can't use algorithm A for a certain house and algorithm B for another. That makes no sense at all. We can't run two simultaneous delivery networks on top of each other. So that's no good. You might think we can just split this up by cities and find lookalike cities and compare the performance of dispatch algorithm A operating in Oxford and Bath and Brighton against B operating in some part of London and Cambridge and so on. Unfortunately, the power of that experiment to measure something where the kind of magnitude we're trying to measure is a sort of 10-second improvement to something. We're never going to get the statistical significance out of this to be able to statistically tell whether A or B is better at that level of precision. There's crossover experiment designs where you flip back and forth. So on Monday this one's A, and then Tuesday it's B, Wednesday it's A, and so on it's B. Those don't work very well because we have massive daily variation. So there's certain days that are much more that will get a lot more demand than others, and then all sorts of other sort of things intervene. So by doing this, you strip out quite a lot of the city level noise. So you do get a certain amount more precision, but you also have no randomization in a different direction. So that makes this extremely unhelpful, except on very long time frames, which obviously you don't want either. And so the kind of things that we've ended up with which we've been using very solidly for the last couple of years are these, where you do randomized crossover design. So on Monday there's London B, but Bedford is A, and then they all flip back and forth, and that lets you strip out the city-based noise and compare and have cross-city comparisons that make sense. So this stuff works really well. It provides dramatically more experimental power than doing the simple sort of city stuff, and gives you the causal relationships you need. And so that's great, and we've made great success of this. There's one thing that this doesn't let you do though, which is to, if the change you're making is likely to change the customer experience, so this is great for measuring network level things and rider level things and sort of, to some extent, restaurant level things, but rider and network level things is great. If the customer experience is slightly different in A versus B, then this is unhelpful, because it's not randomizing effectively over customers in a way that makes sense. So that's the sort of level beyond this, which there are some things we do which one obvious thing to point out is that different algorithms you might use might make it more or less likely that you're going to be late turning up at a customer. So that clearly is a customer-facing difference, and you would want to understand the consequences of that. The consequence of that, unfortunately, are not short-term consequences. There's maybe a mildly larger possibility the customer might call up our customer services. But the really important consequence you would care about is if that causes a retention problem over the weeks ahead. And so that's very challenging to measure here, but we're gradually inching our way towards measuring those sorts of things as well. And with that, I think I've done my 20 minutes. So thank you.
I will go roving reporter with my super fun microphone, so if anyone wants to raise their hands, anyone got a question for Vince?
Hi, I wanted to know if you measure and how important exclusive content is, and how would you apportion value to different restaurants or courses?
So there's different kinds of exclusive content. So the most so tell me if I'm not answering your question in the way that you intended. So one set of exclusive content is that we have relationships with some restaurants where they're exclusive on our platform. Yeah. So they're not on anyone else's platform. That varies a bit by market. In the UK, we have a very high percentage of exclusive content. Measuring the value of that is hard. There are a couple of circumstances where we have done that, or at least tried to do it in various ways. Sometimes when we've signed, mostly only for the larger chains, so when we've managed to get an exclusive contract with a large restaurant chain, and on the rare occasions when we've lost one, we've tried to measure those sorts of things. I can't say we've done it super successfully, but it's also something where some of our experiments we do. What I haven't mentioned at all is the main user interface really for customers is a restaurant list that you scroll up and down on, and in some cases you can scroll left, right, and things as well. The ranking of those lists, the sequencing, all sorts of algorithms go into that. There are some things we do in that area which can tell us the relative importance of certain kinds of restaurants versus others. So there's some things we've gleaned from that. So there's a mixture of a few hard numbers which are not directly answering your question, and some slightly sort of softer kind of econometric type analyses which are trying to specifically answer that, and we kind of triangulate between the two.
One more.
Coming from King, have you experimented with gamification or other loyalty ideas with Deliveroo?
So yeah, it's a very good question. A little bit, and there's lots more sort of thoughts planned there. So interesting. The primary loyalty scheme we have at Deliveroo is actually a subscription scheme called Deliveroo Plus that we introduced around the time I joined, and that's going extremely well. And for that reason, that has made us not. It's sort of set a very high bar for success of any kind of possible competing loyalty schemes, because it's hard to imagine that any sort of standard kind of loyalty scheme through points and awards and achievements and all that kind of stuff, it's hard to imagine that having an equal effect because it's doing so well. However, what we would like to do is layer some aspects of that on top of Deliveroo Plus, and so things like that are stuff that we are at the very least actively thinking about. There's also clearly opportunities on both the rider side and the restaurant side in terms of there are certain behaviours that we'd like to encourage. One of the problems that can happen when you look at that delivery network is that there's no obligation on the riders to accept any order at all. So the thing will pop up on their phone. Here's an order from Wagamama's. Do you want it or not? And if many riders reject that, that's clearly a horrific customer experience, because the delivery time for the customer is just going to keep going up. and depending on how that integrates with the food cooking time horizon, it might end up that the food at some point is already cooked and there's still not a rider, and so the food's going to be cold. So there's lots of things in that area about how can we encourage the right kind of behaviour. Our riders massively value flexibility, so we can't possibly force them to do anything. But we would like to encourage them to think that if you accept 80% of the orders you're offered, that's a great thing. And how much of that can we do through gamification and badges and achievements, and how much of that needs either instead or in addition needs financial incentives attached. So there are some things like that that already exist today in Deliveroo's rider experience, but there's clearly more possible opportunities there as well. And certainly from the restaurant point of view, one of the peculiar things about most restaurants, a handful of restaurants have loyalty schemes. Well, a moderate number of restaurants have loyalty schemes. A tiny handful have loyalty schemes that actually meaningfully work. But they're all super interested. Restaurants love loyal customers. They, in the real sort of person-to-person interaction, if you're a loyal customer of a restaurant, they'll often give you a free dish or a nice drink after your meal or whatever. That's just a natural thing in the restaurant industry. In the digital world, they would love to recreate that. So there's sort of opportunities there for how we can bring those things together. So yes, but it's so far surprisingly little.
Brilliant. Thank you again to Vince. I know we've kept you longer than we promised we would.
Thank you.
A big warm thank you to Vince.